For the daisy block, you have a beige background, a green, darker green piece that is for the stems and leaf, and a red piece for the petals, and a golden yellow piece for the center. You can use whatever method you want to applicate this. I do not trim down my background until I'm finished applicating. I did trace the whole design onto my background so that I could do either back basting or the starch and press, or any other method you like. If you want to use fusible, that's fine. If you're doing all starch and press or all fusible, you really don't need to trace it onto the wrong side. I'm not going to spend a lot of time or any time showing you how to applicate this month. If you need a refresher, go back to the month where we did it. So here's my finished daisy block. I used back basting for the stem and for the leaf, and then I did starch and press for everything else. For the blue blossom, you have a background piece that is cream, and it has polka dots in it, although if you want to mix up the backgrounds, it doesn't make any difference. We have a blue piece for the petals, a green piece for the stem and leaves, and a red piece for the center of the flower. Once again, I marked the whole design on my back side so that I could use whichever method I wanted. I used back basting for the stem, but I used starch and press for everything else. So it's completely up to you what method you want to use. For the framed pinwheel, we have 3 pieces of fabric. The first one is a blue dot rectangle. This is what the pattern is calling beige, but ours is more cream and it has letters sprinkled all over it. And then we have a brown strip. From both our blue and our beige or cream, we're cutting 2.5 inch squares. So I'm just going to put mine together, right sides together. And I'm going to cut a 5 by 2.5 inch rectangle from this. So I'm cleaning up 2 edges. And then turn your mat or walk around if you're going to do them stacked. I don't want to disturb them. And then I'm going to line up my 2.5 inch line along the long edge that I just cleaned up, my 5 inch line along the short edge, and cut. So now I have a 2.5 by 5 inch rectangle. I'm going to back my ruler up to the 2.5 inch mark on the short end, any line along the long edges just to keep everything straight, and cut. We're either going to draw one line through the center diagonally from point to point, and then so a 1/4 inch away from that line on each side, or you can use the magic wand or a similar device. And I'm lining up my scored line with my points. In this case, I will mark 2 lines and then I will sew on those lines because we're making half square triangle units out of this. So I'll do the same thing on both of these. Now I'm going to take it to my sewing machine and sew on those lines. So whichever way you do it, it's a 1/4 inch from the center. I've stitched my 2 lines, so now I need to cut this apart between the lines. If you drew the single line, you can cut on the line. This could be scissors too. It's not that important that it stays exactly a 1/4. You do want a nice seam allowance there. And then I'm going to open it up and press toward the blue. So I will have 4 half square triangle units. And once I have pressed it, I need to trim it down to 2 inches square. You can use a regular ruler, or if you have the block, which I do, that's what I'm going to use. I'm going to line this up, and I don't have a lot to trim off. So my groove goes on the seam, and you want to make sure the point is also landing on the seam. You want to make sure you're going to have at least 2 inches down here after you trim off whatever's on this end. And then you can just rotate the ruler, slide back to the 2 inch mark here and here, trim, and trim, and you're going to do that to all 4 of them. Once we have all our half square triangle units trimmed down to 2 inches, we are going to sew them together in rows. Make sure you lay it out so you do get the pinwheel design. Once we have the rows, I'll press toward the blue, and then I will sew the 2 rows together, matching those seams in the center. After I sewed my 2 rows together, I did pop the center seam and press so that my seams are going around. We're going to trim our brown strip down to 1.5 inches wide. And I do have a selvage on one end of mine, and you probably do too. So I also have my piece folded in half because I'm working on a smaller surface. So I am going to line up a line on my fold. Although it doesn't really matter because we're going to be cutting short pieces off of it. So if there was a V at the fold, in this case, it wouldn't matter. I'm going to walk around, put my 1.5 inch line on the line that I just clean cut. Now, if for some reason your pinwheel didn't measure 3.5 inches, if it was less than that, you have enough fabric here that you could cut this a little bit wider so that this block still ended up as a 5.5 inch block. Okay, I need 2 5.5 inch pieces and 2 3.5 inch pieces from this strip. Remember, it's folded in half. So 5.5 plus 3.5 is 9 inches. So I have my 9-inch line on my short end, any lines on my long edges to keep everything straight. I'm going to cut, and then you can back your ruler up to either 5.5 or 3.5. It doesn't make any difference. And cut. And now we're just going to frame our pinwheel out with our brown strips. So I will sew the short ones onto opposite sides. I'll press toward the brown and then add my 2 longer pieces after that to the 2 remaining sides. The finished framed pinwheel block. All of my frame is pressed out away from the center. Should be a 5.5 inch block. For the ring around the Rosy block, we have a red square, a beige strip, and a blue strip. We are going to cut strip to 1.5 inches wide, and then the pattern says to leave the length as it is at about 1 3/4. Your piece is going to be bigger than 1 3/4. So if you want to trim it down to 1 3/4, that's fine, because the pieces we're matching it up to are going to be 1 3/4. So I'm cutting it 1.5 wide by 1 3/4, or you can just leave it as long as it is. That's fine. And then our beige strip, we are going to cut down to 1.5 inches wide. I'm going to just fold it in half, and I'm going to just line up a line on the fold to keep it straight. And you can walk around, but I'm going to cheat. I'm going to rotate it because it's fairly short, but if you do that, you run the risk of getting it out of alignment if you have it folded in half. So we're turning it to 1.5. And then from that we need 2 3.5 inch pieces and 2 1 3/4 inch pieces. I'm just going to cut them off. So 3.5. And 1 3/4. Okay. So now I'm going to take those 2 1 3/4 inch pieces and sew them to opposite sides of the red rectangle that I cut. Once you've sewn the beige strips on both sides, press toward the beige. Now from this piece, we are going to cut a 1.5 inch strip or slice. So I'm going to line up lines with my seams, clean cut one edge, and then rotate it, line up lines again with the seams, and I'm going to line the 1.5 inch mark up with my edge that I already cleaned up and cut. And then I'm going to add the remaining 2 strips of beige to the other 2 sides. Once we've sewn the 2 longer beige strips on, we're going to press out toward the beige. And then we're going to trim our blue strip out down to 1.5 inches wide, and again you will have selvage on one end. So I have mine folded in half just because I'm working on a smaller space. It's up to you. You can fold it in half or not. Again, if your centerpiece didn't measure 3.5 inches, you could always make this just a little bit wider so that you have your 5.5 inch block when you finish. I'm going to line up my 1.5 inch mark on the line I just cut, and then from this I need to cut 2 5.5 inch pieces and 2 3.5. It's folded in half, so I am cutting 2 at once. I'm just going to go ahead and back off and cut off my 5.5 inch piece. Move that out of the way, then my 3.5 inch piece, and again I'm lining up with the cut edge. And now we're going to frame this out, put our 2 shorter blue edges along 2 opposite sides. I'm actually matching them up with the sides that had the short before, but you wouldn't have to. And then we'll press toward the blue after we sew those on, and then we'll add the last 2 pieces on the remaining 2 sides, and again press toward the blue. My finished ring around the Rosy block on this one, all of the outside border is pressed away from the center, and this one should be a 5.5 inch block. For the Red Cross block, we have a red strip, what the pattern is calling a beige strip, but ours is more cream, and a green strip. We are going to trim our red strip down to 1.5 inches wide, and I'm going to fold mine in half. So since I'm folding, I'm going to line up a line with my fold to keep everything straight. Cut. And I will walk around, finish cutting it down to 1.5. Now, from this strip, I need 2 pieces that are 3.5 inches long and 4 pieces that are 1.5 inches long. So, because I have that folded in half, that would be 6.5 inches. So I can just go ahead and cut a 6.5 inch piece off. If you did not have it folded in half, that would be 13 inches. Go ahead and cut at 6.5, so I have a line lined up with my long straight edge, and the 6.5 inch mark is lined up with my short cut edge. And I'm going to back my ruler off to 3 inches because that will leave my 3.5 inch long piece here, and then I'm going to back off to 1.5, and that gives me my 1.5 inch squares. And then our beige strip, we're cutting it to 1.5 inches wide. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up 2 sides. And we need from this 2 3.5 inch strips, so that would be 3.5 times 2 is 7. So I'm going to put my 7 inch mark on my short edge and my 1.5 inch mark on my long edge. And cut. And then I'm going to back up to my 3.5 inch mark. Okay. So I am going to sew the two beige pieces to opposite sides of one of the 3.5 inch long red pieces. Once I've sewn my cream or beige, whatever you want to call it, to the two sides of the red, I did press out toward the beige. And now from this we need to cut two 1.5 inch pieces, and these should be 3.5. So I'm going to line up lines with my seams in the center and slice off one edge to clean it up. And then I need 3 inches, so I'll line up lines again with the seam and the 3-inch mark with the edge I just cut, trim, and then I'm going to back off to 1.5. I am still lining up seams with my seam allowances because that keeps everything straight. So there's those two. And then I am going to sew the remaining red rectangle between those two to give me my cross. I'm going to cut my green strip down to 1.5 inches wide. So I'm cleaning up 2 edges. And I do have my piece folded in half. And from this 1.5 inch strip, we need 4 3.5 inch rectangles. So 3.5 times 2 is 7. So I'm lining my 1.5 inch line on the long edge that I just cut. I'm lining up my 7-inch line on the short end that I just cut. I'm going to cut. Then I'm going to back my ruler up to 3.5 inches. I'm putting any line on my long cut edge now just to keep it straight, and cut. Now on the ends of 2 of these, I'm going to sew the 4 red squares that I have. So just like that. After sewing my 2 piece strips to the edges, we press in toward the red. And then we are going to take 2 of our green pieces and sew them to opposite sides of our red cross. Okay, I pressed toward the green on all of my pieces, which means when I go to add these guys to the top and bottom of the main part, my seams are going in opposite directions so they will nest. I'm going to sew these on. Here's my finished red cross block. Once I added my last 2 strips, I pressed out away from the center. If you've been counting, yes, there were 5 blocks this month. The piece ones are pretty easy. If you absolutely feel you cannot get 5 blocks done in a month, then I will accept 4 for completed homework. Just realize you do have to do them all to get the quilt put together. I have not trimmed down my 2 applique blocks yet. They do need to be trimmed down to 5.5 inch blocks.